When is process valuable? And when is process actually a distraction from the productivity that it's supposed to create? Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And today's story, we dive right into the heart of a key communication issue, which is negotiations, and where processes actually help and where they actually harm and drag down productivity. So definitely want to stick around for that.
So here's my story. As you know, I have very definite ideas about communication in a wide variety of areas. And in particular, that's applicable to this story, how to negotiate.
Good.
Yeah. Hey, that's a great thing.
Random piece of information. Yes. Now onto the story.
Is how to negotiate, how to communicate with the other side.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe, particularly when it comes to contracts, which I'm called on to do all the time, I believe that there is a productive way to do it. Spoiler alert, my way, and an unproductive way to do it, which is the way that most other people do it. And I'll tell you, so the way I see a lot of people doing it, particularly in contracts, is when you have, they send over their version of a contract, you mark it up. There are 27 different provisions where there are changes. You get on the phone with the other side and you go provision by provision and you negotiate it down. And that's very logical. It's very organized. You go through the whole contract. Mm-hmm. What I prefer to do, however, is not hone in on the 27 different areas of disagreement. I prefer to break it down into themes. I like to have an overarching conversation to say, look, here are the things that are really important to us. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about what your thoughts are. And those three things or those couple themes will ripple through the 27. But I like to get agreement on the overall areas of importance. And I have found time and time again that that's really where I find the most success in coming up with a collaborative solution with the other side that allows us each to preserve our respective interests and preserve the relationship as well.
Sure.
I ran headlong into what is kind of like a buzzsaw with that, and I'm still in the middle of it recently because I was proposing this. My client is in negotiations with a very large international company. They have counsel out of New York. So it's the
international company.
The international company has counsel out of New York. So it's kind of local. And we were talking about this and I said, look, why don't we just get on the phone? We'll have the lawyers get on the phone, talk about the legal terms. And there are just a couple things that I want to go over in these overarching things. And they said, no, here's what we want you to do. Send over a red line of the entire agreement. Now, this contract is about 120 some odd pages. Send over a red line of the agreement. What we do is we enter everything, and we have a team that enters everything into a negotiation log. Okay. And then we have our negotiating committee. We'll set up a call with you and certain principals, and we'll go over this.
Is it weird that I have nothing to do with this and I'm getting weirdly angry about that?
And right. So I said, well, I can appreciate this. We're going back and forth in email. I can appreciate that, but why don't we just have I promise you, the conversation won't take more than half an hour, probably closer to 15 minutes, on just the overall areas of concern and see where we have any disagreements on those. And it's going to make the entire process more streamlined. So, and I said, call me. Let me know when you're available. I had left a voicemail. They didn't pick up. I said, let me know when you're available. Let's just have a conversation. And I got an email back and they said, It was a very nice email from their chief counsel that said, I really wasn't a believer either in the negotiation law, but I've come around. So this is what we're going to do. So
just shh. You're going to like it. Just be quiet.
You're going to like it. It'll be fine. So my client was getting irritated too because of all this stuff going on. Not irritated at me, but they really wanted just to have this conversation. They're told at every point. Because
correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to interrupt your story, but just the way you do it, here's what I'm imagining. So I just want to check in on this. That conversation where you make some like generalized agreements about a few things that you want to get on the same page is is like, I imagine there being this big pile of dirt that needs to be moved for there to be agreement. That conversation is like a backhoe that can like eliminate or add to, like, it can remove an entire swath of red lines you may have because that's not an issue, or that is an issue, or we're already in agreement.
Yeah,
or like it can eliminate
absolutely.
huge swath versus the way they want to do it is like trying to move it with a plastic spoon.
Yeah,
like first we're going to log every little
horrible.
tiny plastic spoon version and then compare notes.
Well, that's exactly right. Because if you reach agreement on the overall themes, then you can say, okay, well, this provision we already talked about. Let's just talk about the language a little bit because we already agreed on what we want to accomplish with these things. And so it breaks it up into these much larger
like guiding
pieces,
principles almost.
Yes. Well, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
So it's much easier. Well, anyway, the end of the story really is that tomorrow I have been invited, although invited is a nice way of saying it's a command performance. I'm required to participate in a conference call to go over the entire 120-page contract with 15 people.
No, on a conference call?
On a conference call.
Is this like Dante's 12th level?
It's somewhere around there. It's yes. If it's not the 12th, it's definitely in double digits. So
wow.
So yeah. So I'm looking at this, and there are 3 hours blocked out. Mm-hmm. I was talking to my client about this, who is just really upset that we were forced into this, but they. They're not.
Do you realize that's a minute per page, basically, which is not happening?
It's not happening. But my client is not calling the shots here. They want to do this project, and so we're going to have to dance in accordance with the other person's tune. And it strikes me that I am so angry and so proprietary over the way I think the conversation should be handled that this kind of structure is just
okay. So, out of fairness, you and I do tend to think alike. We kind of come from the same mental space on how we go about things. So it is possible that I am not objective about this, but I do differentiate highly between I have a process and you have a process, and we're going to argue whose process is best. I mean, this is not arguing about whether the toilet paper roll goes over or under.
There's no
it's
argument.
like I know. Are you over or under?
Over.
Yeah, me too. See, okay, then we don't have to argue about it. But let's say we were going to argue about it. That is purely a basis of opinion, and you're going to have like substantiating facts between yours, substantiating facts between another one. But it's still just like two ways to get to the same result.
Oh no, it's not a matter of opinion.
Don't,
because there's a patent with the toilet paper, and it shows it clearly over. But anyway,
okay, don't get distracted. But in this case, this is not just this. This is a sort of a nuance, I think, between like the difference between two processes and the difference, because it's interesting. You said like being productive, like there's a huge question, I think, of like when a process is productive and when it is just the like status quo process, like we've always done it this way, or worse. And I can totally imagine, I can make up a story very easily about how that process got put into place and why it seemed like a great idea. I was reminded, I think I've even told this story on the show at some point. There's an old story in my family, and it may be like an old wives' tale kind of thing, but I don't know. I think it's actually a story from someone of a cousin who would like always cut the ends off of the ham. You know, the hams that you get that have the little like things that she would always cut the two ends off the ham before she baked it. And her husband said, well, why do you do that? And she goes, well, my mom always did it. So she's like, I'll ask her. So she asks her mom, and her grandmother was still alive. And she goes, well, that's how my mom taught me to make it. Like, I'll ask her. And so they asked the grandmother, and she laughs hysterically and says, oh my goodness, I did that because the only pan I had was like, she only had like a 9x9 pan, and so to fit the ham in the pan, she had to cut the ends off. There was no functional purpose whatsoever for cutting the ends of the ham off, but it had now continued for 2 more generations just because that's how they'd been taught to do it. And so I can get very, I, by the way, could have told the exact story that you are telling about. My version of that is with agendas for meetings or facilitations.
Okay.
Like they serve a purpose, absolutely.
Sure.
But they are so often, much like in your story, this tail that wags the dog and does not get the dog where the dog really needs to go. But everyone's like, hey, we followed the agenda, yay on us. Which is good because you don't want to spend the time going down rabbit holes and whatnot. But there's a way that I think about processes and how you keep them from, because I think that's the nugget of this. Like, when is process valuable and when is process actually a distraction from the productivity that it's supposed to create. So whenever I do these things, I think about how to create. I always think of it as like, what's the tiniest little hint of structure that you need to prevent chaos so that you have the freedom to work creatively and in flow, but things won't go off the rails, versus when there is structure for structure's sake or things that just get out of hand. I think it gets in the way of communication. It gets in the way of like getting to a real problem. And a lot of times it creates work that is then not even work that's on the path to like real value.
Right. And I think it serves a different master. So when you said you could easily come up with a rationale for this negotiation log, the rationale that I come up with is that what they've elevated to the priority is creating a record. So they want to go back and create a record. So that's really about being in the future, looking back to the past. The agenda is about creating a rationale in part for the future. This is what we want to have accomplished, but it's not about in the present. It doesn't give you, neither one of them gives you the ability to create the results in the present that are the most valuable.
So it's interesting. You said they elevated. So two things came up for me on that is one, there's a process that you create and that has to be stuck to when you're going to ripple something out to people for whom either won't have access to or the ability to think on their feet on their own. So, it's like franchising a thing. Like when you franchise a thing so that anybody can pick it up, turnkey, make it happen. They don't have to have a super entrepreneurial, they want to run a business, but they're not they don't have that entrepreneurial mind of like, oh, I want to innovate and make things better and do this. They're like, I want take tab B, stick and slide A. And if I follow all the rules, this system will work.
Right. It's what one of my clients calls a guerrilla system. You could take a gorilla.
Oh, okay.
And a gorilla would be
what?
No, that's what he calls it. It's a guerrilla system. You could put a gorilla in there, teach them the franchise, and they do it.
And there are absolutely portions of business, portions of life, portions of everything where that is the most appropriate thing.
Sure.
But I would argue in law, and I have to assume these New York lawyers are probably not your like off the shelf, super cheap, barely made it through law school lawyers. I would want to set up systems that allow them to be smart and thoughtful and use their best brains rather than spending their time. So yeah, it's just so interesting, like what you elevate there. My mind also flipped to, again, my version of with agendas, like agendas are important, but the way I put agendas together, it's this kind of arc on the path to where they ultimately want to get. It is my hope that we get through that whole arc in that day. And usually a huge part of my agenda setting is taking the 87 things that they wanted to get done in our half day together or a full day together and saying, okay, we might only get through these first like 3 or 4 because everything takes longer than people think it does. But the thing that I have to hold true to, and I think, and this is hard because people want to have that kind of adrenaline, feel good, short-term satisfying feeling of we accomplished a thing. When I have that arc, there is usually a critical path there. I mean, sometimes they're like 3 or 4 separate things, but I always put the most important one first. And I will say to people, like, look, this is what I think we can accomplish today. But this first thing that we're doing is our first step in moving you to your like much bigger goal a year from now. So if it takes us all day, and if it takes us another half day after this, like to really nail that down appropriately, we're not going to squander our time, but we have to finish this with integrity before we move on to the next thing. And that was a skill that took me a while to get to, actually, because it feels yucky to feel like you didn't get it done fast enough or you didn't get far enough. But those are indulgent.
Well, but I think that for a lot of times, and this is what when I was listening to you, what really came to mind is that a lot of structure is a reaction to fear. And what I mean by that is that, so in the negotiation log in my story, I think that they put that structure in because it was a reaction to their greatest fear that maybe they wouldn't have a precise record of everything.
Yep.
Maybe, sometimes when you have your 87 item agenda, it's a fear of not touching on what is the most important point or set of points in that 87 point agenda and not doing the work to figure out what would be a success. If we just hit these 3, this is what we care about. I think that a lot of the negotiation structures are a reaction to fear. If we don't put this structure in, then we're afraid that X will happen.
Yeah. So I'm going to intentionally step away from like the parallel to the agenda and facilitation piece, because I actually think that's a separate, I don't think it's this fear-based. I think it's another huge trap, because I want to come back to this. In negotiations, absolutely high probability of being fear-based. You go into those conversations, at least the way most people do it. I don't think it's the way you do it, which is part of why I value how you do that. But people come into it with the like, what do I have to protect? What's going to be taken from me? It is this very fear-based, and those kinds of structures in a lot of structures are like, how's somebody going to mess up? How's this going to be? For a while, Baltimore, this sounds like a tangent, but it's not. For a while, Baltimore County Public Schools had a provision where architects were not allowed to design media centers even. So media centers is the one place in the school where you really want to have carpet because of acoustics and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And maybe also the auditorium sometimes, but for a while, and I don't know if this is still the case, you were not allowed to spec carpet in there because they were having an issue where they couldn't seem to keep the staff from waxing the carpet. They would wax the linoleum floors and then just head right on into the media center. And which is a great example of like a rule or a structure being put into place out of like fear or frustration. And right. Sometimes those are necessary, and sometimes they just take value from an end game process. But that distinction in and of itself is a really nuanced thing that requires ... communication and thoughtfulness. And so I think that's where there's a big trap there in the middle.
No, I think there's absolutely a trap there. And I think there has to be somewhere in the organization, like in my counterpart's organization, the client, not the New York lawyers, but the client's organization, there has to be enough insight to talk about the process and what we're trying to protect and what we're losing when we try to protect that. And I think that's where the problem has arisen, because their process has grown, well, how do we make the log better? How do we make it more efficient to create this process, right, as opposed to whether we should have this process in effect in the first place? And what kind of communication are we precluding? Are we preventing? And
what's really fascinating to me about your exact example is those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Like, you could have your upfront conversation about the themes, and then redline based on those hierarchies of thought, those filters that you've established, and reduce the time. Now, I won't make the crack about like, maybe that's why they do it, is they want to have more time that they're billing for. They don't want to make the conversation shorter and more efficient, which may or may not be the case, but it's given the benefit of the doubt. That is a way to actually, in theory, improve the process. We have this one conversation, and then everything gets more clear. Because it's funny, I so get this. I spent the summer assisting a client that facilitated a bunch of conversations that actually came back to some document negotiation that was going on. And I cannot tell you, I mean, this will be very familiar to you, I'm sure. I can't tell you how many examples there were. And I had to kind of keep reminding people where we came back to, where like one side put a thing in for a reason that made sense. And then like the other side like took out a portion of that thing, but then like the other part of it got left in. And then on its own, that piece of it seemed like egregious and caused all these other issues. And people like, you're trying to do this and this. And they kept negotiating that piece of it as if it had been put in and of itself on its own, for its own reason, and it hadn't. And I was like, back up. Why is this even in here anymore? It was a piece of this other thing. And if the other thing came out, then maybe this whole thing should come out. But it became this huge conversation. And it was fascinating to me. I mean, it was not my job to negotiate the contract. So I didn't have that kind of influence over the process, but it was interesting how much, this is truly a forest for the trees thing. Like all these little pieces and the red lines of a contract, or all these little individual trees and blades of grass. And there is this tendency to not step back and look at the forest and say, like, what are we painting here? Like, what is this? I'm mixing metaphors.
Well, it's not just a tendency not to step back. In the story with the negotiation log, when you said that you could have that negotiation log in conjunction with and following the larger conversation about themes, the important point to me, though, is that while that's true, the discussion about that was not permitted. So what's important to see is what are the conversations that we're not allowed to have? In my example, in my story, we weren't allowed to have a conversation about how we're going to conduct this negotiation because that was deemed to be a fait accompli. That is, we're going to have it our way. We're going to use our negotiation law. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And so it strikes me as an interesting question of what are the conversations we're not even allowed to have because they don't fit. You know, if we have a defined process, then we're not allowed to have certain conversations that go against that. And we're not allowed to discuss whether those processes make sense. And here, we're not allowed to discuss that anymore.
Yeah. And it's, oh gosh, this is such a rich area of conversation for any company or team or frankly, even a family, I think, because I can completely feel this other annoying side of things sometimes where, you know, if you've been around a topic several times and you've come to a solution that feels like it has solved the problem that you were constantly having, and then there is energy to always reinvestigate it and talk about it again and say, well, is there a better way we could do this? That can be exhausting sometimes, you know. I don't know why this popped into my mind, but I think it's funny. I had a receptionist one time at the architecture firm who, and to the point of this, she actually didn't ask us about it. She just did it. She came in and she reorganized all the mailboxes of everyone. She alphabetized them so that she's like, well, it's just so much easier when I'm doing the mail. I'll know exactly where everyone is. And we actually had it categorized by, you know, it was the mailbox was like 4 across each row. And it just so happened we had 4 principals and 4 seniors, 4 associates. So those were like in 2 lines. So if you had to send something to all principals, it was like, duk, 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 you know, the whole leadership team, they were the top 8 or whatever. So there was a rhyme or reason to the thing. And then everyone knew where their own mailbox was. So for weeks, it was like chaos because you'd come in and you like grab someone else's mail and you go back down. It was just one of these funny things. I'm like, you don't get to just redesign processes or just without asking. But when things come up over and over and over again, like when are processes important and they don't get to be redesigned, and when is it worth saying? Because in this case, like them saying like, no, we're not going to talk about how we do this. We're using my system. It reminds me of your and process from like, oh yeah, I'm totally great with using your system. And before we use it, can we have this other conversation? They may have well said no, but that is, I think, one of those ways that you can kind of find the middle ground. But I love this point of where does, I mean, as you said, like negotiation is this really important subset of communication. And when you couldn't even communicate about how you're going to communicate that communication, it's like this triple backstop between you and actually getting to a problem that's solved.
Right. We're reaching an impasse in negotiating how the negotiation is going to be conducted. And so you decide, well, you know what? I'm not going to negotiate the process of negotiation. Let's just get right to the negotiation itself. And I'm tired before I even start the process.
Yeah.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us. Which is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.